Other stories we're tracking for you this morning. In what could be a landmark case for women's rights in South Africa, the Women's Legal Centre will act as a friend of the court in a new case seeking spousal rights for women not in a civil union if their domestic partner dies. Now, South African law currently does not allow women cohabiting to claim spousal recognition from their deceased partner's estate, despite the fact that 3.5 million South Africans live in such partnerships. Let's unpack the story now. We're joined by an attorney at the Women's Legal Centre, Charlene May. Charlene, thanks again for your time this morning on the AM report. So I suppose the important thing for us to draw attention to just ahead of this case is this issue around domestic partnerships, cohabitation, and the rights of heterosexual couples in this kind of arrangement. What are the current rights?
So I think what's important for us at the Women's Legal Centre and what's important for your viewers to know that are living in domestic partnerships or are cohabitating is that the law doesn't recognize that as a relationship that can bring similar rights as in a formalized marriage, either under the Marriages Act or the Civil Unions Act. And many of the women that approach us every year seeking legal advice around this issue are actually under the misconception that common law marriages exist in South African law, and that if you live with your partner for a certain period of time, that this common law marriage comes into effect, and that you would then have certain rights to claim housing, to claim property, or to claim maintenance from that individual once the relationship comes to an end.
So this is an important issue, particularly, there are so many issues that we look at now through the lens of COVID-19. And we talk often about how important it is, especially now, to get all of our affairs in order. But this case is important if there is no such will that is in place. For example, you're not married, there's no will in place, there's absolutely no contract in place. If someone dies suddenly, this kind of case then becomes incredibly important.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And what's so important is that what's happened with the COVID pandemic and the measures that's been put in place is that it's highlighted the inequalities and the discrimination that is already present within our society. In the past week at the Women's Legal Centre, we've had 2 queries from women where their partners have passed on as of COVID. And in both instances, those women have seen family members coming to the house, demanding access to the house, women being excluded from participating in the funeral arrangements because they're not viewed as or seen as being the wife or the spouse, and therefore not entitled to the same benefits.
Charlene, tell me, does that change if there are children involved? If I am in a relationship where we are living together, we're in a domestic partnership, and we've had children together, does that change that in any way?
So the children, unfortunately, doesn't change the relationship between the parents. The children, of course, have independent rights. So the child would have independent right to maintenance and to support from that deceased estate. But the mother, unfortunately, wouldn't be able to rely on the same rights recognition. And I think that's important because many women, based on our experience, many women would stay in relationships where there are children, even though their partner perhaps would choose not to enter into a marriage or would not want to formalize that relationship. Women will very often stay because they want to provide a stable home for their children, but they would derive no rights in law from remaining.
And just as a flip side, Charlene, if it happens that the woman in the relationship dies, these laws apply to the man as well, in their current form.
I'm sorry, just repeat that?
Just if we look at the flip side of the story, if a woman in that cohabiting relationship dies unexpectedly, the man would face the same challenges that women do in this current situation.
He would face same challenge. But what we're arguing really strongly for, and your flip side scenario actually illustrates it very nicely, is if you look at the marriage statistics and the survey that's conducted by Statistics South Africa, more women readily admit to being in domestic partnerships and cohabitating than their counterparts. And that says a lot. It says to us that women are readily willing to admit that they are in committed relationships, whereas men will very often on these surveys tick the single box, even though they are cohabitating. And so we see that playing out when when relationships come to an end. Men will very often in domestic partnerships then say, oh no, we were never in a committed relationship. She doesn't need to inherit or benefit in any way because it was just a girlfriend. And so that's where we're saying the real discrimination plays out, that it's the lived reality of women.
Look, I think that's the topic for a whole other discussion on the channel around that issue. But I want to ask you, this issue around domestic partnerships, there's been fights around the state recognizing these partnerships for such a long time now. Does there seem to be a reluctance on the part of government to do this?
I think that there is. I think a lot of it has to do with political will. Issues around women, we know historically in this country, we've struggled with rights realization. And so although we have recognition in many instances in the Constitution and in our laws, we really struggle with implementation. And so it does certainly come down to an issue around political will. The Law Reform Commission started looking at this issue as far back as 2006. The Department of Home Affairs in 2008 had a draft bill, and that all of it has just seemed to disappear. And in the case before the Western Cape High Court now, the Minister of Justice was a party to that case, has indicated that the government has no intention of recognizing domestic partnerships. And so it really does at this stage lie with the courts in order to move things along for women and to ensure those constitutional rights are recognized and protected.
That's a strange stance to take, isn't it? I mean, the numbers that I have here is that 3.5 million South Africans choose to live in such domestic partnerships.
It certainly is. Look, we know that the Department of Home Affairs has indicated that it is doing a review of all of the family law in the country and that it is looking to consolidating all of the marriage laws. It's unclear how far that process is and whether or not COVID's had an impact on how quickly government can move this legislation along. But as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, the impact of COVID, we are certainly seeing that there is a need to move things along in terms of the legislative development process. And we know that that can be done. Legislation can be fast-tracked if there is political will to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks very much for your time. Charlene May is an attorney at the Women's Legal Centre, and the centre is acting as a friend of the court, this landmark case for the rights of unmarried couples, which is before the Western Cape High Court. Thanks so much for joining us on the AM Report.